The wasteland appeared suddenly, full of danger and opportunity, and many people have developed their own territory on this land. Now that Ross wants to become one of them, he has no choice. He is the prince of the Kaitar kingdom. Because of the persecution of the throne, he has no choice but to apply for a development order to open up the wasteland. Alone, he stood on the border of the Cottonies territory, he straightened his chest, and entered the deserted wasteland. After discovering that there was an orc tribe and some vassal tribes, the Cottonies territory stopped developing further, and now his territory is enough for an earl territory. Therefore, what Ross will face is an orc tribe and his vassal tribe. Ross wasn't too nervous either. He had a system. The moment he got the development order, he understood that if he had the golden finger, he wouldn't die so easily as long as he was smart. Although he is alone, he has 10,000 gold coins as compensation in the system, which is the last gift given to him by the seriously ill king. Ross looked at the endless wasteland and said with a smile, "My kingdom will rise today." He immediately turned on the system and checked the recruitment. Now he can only recruit 10 heavy cavalry, 20 retinue cavalry, 30 heavy infantry, 80 medium infantry, 100 archers, and 500 infantry. This is one of his recruitment rights. These arms are ordinary arms, and when he uses technology, he can recruit Greek heavy infantry, Roman legions, Spartans, etc. Now he has 10,000 gold coins. In addition to recruiting soldiers, he has to buy food and materials for building the castle. If he starts from scratch like this, he can only build a wooden castle first, and then replace it with a solid stone castle when he has money. A heavy cavalry requires 40 gold coins, which includes his equipment and horses, but does not include squires. Retinue cavalry 20 gold coins. A heavy infantry requires 20 gold coins, a medium infantry 10 gold coins, an archer hardware coins, and 10 infantry 1 gold coins. Such infantry is composed of free people, with only shields and a 70 cm wide bladed dagger. Ross didn't know how many enemies he had to face, so he could only fill his team first, spending a total of 2,900 gold coins. With a flash of light, 740 soldiers appeared behind him. 10 of the heavy cavalry are equivalent to fief knights, who can serve as his retainers and lead his team. After all, Ross is the head coach, and these knights will be delegated to serve as officers. For example, there were 5 light infantrymen leading the 500 soldiers, 1 leading the archers, 1 leading the 80 medium infantrymen, and the remaining 3 knights and the 30th heavy infantry remained by his side. "Sir, there is a situation." A mellow voice interrupted Ross's thoughts. He tilted his head and saw that a knight standing closest to him was speaking. He saw in the direction the knight pointed, there was a kobold watching in the distance. Ross knew something about this. He frowned and said, "This is the kobold's sentinel. They will definitely report the news. We have to find a place to defend." The knight pointed to the river not far away and said, "Sir, go over there, at least we won't be enemies on all sides." Ross glanced at it and said with a smile, "It's okay, but I still have a solution." The team immediately moved to the river, and they started to form the formation relying on the river. Ross immediately purchased food from the system, and he directly bought 50 carts of food. Ross looked at the grain that appeared, and said quickly, "Unload some of the grain and pile up the grain cart." The light infantry moved immediately, and soon, a small defensive position appeared on the bank of the river. A piece of dust was raised on the flat ground not far away, and soon, an army of greenskin goblins, and kobolds was moving towards this side. The knight glanced at the dust and said, "Sir, they don't have cavalry." Ross nodded and said, "When they get close, let the archers teach them a lesson." Behind the simple fence surrounded by grain carts, there were some archers standing. They had already stuck their bows and arrows on the ground, waiting for the enemy to approach and teach them a lesson. Soon, the opponent's army reached 40 meters away from Ross, and the leader was a goblin with a height of 1.5 meters and a big sword, shouting "Whoa, Whoa, whoa! The group of kobolds, goblins also waved their weapons and shouted, and then rushed towards Ross like a tide. The knight continued, "Sir, the number of opponents is 5,000, we have a chance of winning." Ross didn't know how much he would lose after this battle. Now he just wanted to save his life. He drew his knife and shouted, "Prepare, let go of the arrows." Shhhhhhh. Ah! The enemy army that rushed over instantly fell down dozens of goblins. They screamed sharply, and then ran faster. The archers finished round after round, and the enemy who rushed over had already fallen 200 or 300. Seeing that the enemy was approaching, Ross hurriedly asked the archers to back away. The light infantry behind them had already climbed into the grain cart and put up their shields. The enemy was crowded, and they climbed directly to the grain cart. The infantrymen used their shields to push forward, and then extended short swords from the gap to harvest the enemy's life. But there are a lot of them, and just like they were beaten with blood, they directly stepped on the body of their companions and climbed up. A goblin stepped on the goblin's shoulder, jumped directly onto the shield, and hit the infantryman's head with the bone stick in his hand. The infantry screamed and fell directly to the rear. The goblin jumped down immediately, and before he could stand firm, the shields on both sides directly attacked, and then one knife ended the life of the goblin. However, the gap has been opened, and more enemies are coming over. Ross immediately shouted, "Enter the Chinese infantry." Those medium-loaded infantrymen with square shields, three-meter-long spears in one hand, leather armors and wolfskin hats rushed over, and quickly blocked the gap. Rose saw that the opponent had only attacked one place, and he quickly said to the knight beside him, "What's your name?" "Bile." "Okay, Beer, you lead the rest of the knights and the cavalry to rush out from the other side and attack the enemy's flank." Beer immediately got up and called the rest of the knights to rush out from the other side with the cavalry retinue, and then quickly circled to the enemy's defenseless flank. The knights attacked first, and the cavalry retinue followed behind. When they left the front to attack, 30 heavy infantrymen lined up, ready to charge. As for the knights, they were all heavy cavalry. Although they only had 10 knights, the goblin kobolds had a very low rate of armor, and they were basically all leather armor. Only when the goblins didn't move at the back had more than a dozen sets of iron armor. How could such a group of enemy troops resist the impact of the heavy cavalry? When they saw the heavy cavalry charging, they immediately scattered and fled. Ross saw the opportunity, and he was overjoyed. The opportunity is here, heavy infantry attack. Following Ross's order, the hoplites attacked the rear half of the enemy army, that is, the enemy army fleeing in the direction they were coming and going, so that they could drive the enemy army to disperse their formation. As for the assault against the heavy infantry with guns, don't even think about it. Only the heavy infantry can block each other by colliding with each other. As for the enemy who shoots out their backs, the heavy infantry charges, just like a tank crushing the light infantry. The heavy infantry charged forward, and the enemies were knocked down one after another, or stabbed by the spear. The fallen enemy was trampled by the heavy infantry's iron boots, and the enemy stuck on the spear could only cry in pain. No one is the enemy of unity. The enemies can only try their best to escape. The leader of the coalition, the goblin chief, has now escaped with his subordinates. He already knows that he is defeated. Ross saw that the flag representing the tribe was gone, and the goblin chief who was still in command was gone. He shouted, "Try to catch the ones alive, I want to capture them." The soldiers attacked everywhere, hunting down the fleeing enemies. Whether it was a goblin, or a kobold, they would be caught as long as they surrendered. Their army is disorganized and has no will to fight, and there are acts of arrest by soldiers everywhere on the plain. You won an unprecedented intermediate-scale war victory, rewarded with 1,000 military merit points. This battle killed more than 1,500 enemy troops and gained 150 military merit points. 1 point of military merit can be exchanged for 10 gold coins. A little military merit can also be used as 10 gold coins in the system. Ross saw that this was probably to maintain the world's gold coin reserves. After all, he could buy food and grass in the system, and if he always used gold coins to Krypton gold, the gold in this world will be less and less. He can't always buy it in the system. He has to spend money to go to nearby forces to buy what he needs, and he has to spend money to recruit refugees, so he can use military merit for money. Ross looked up at the sun and said with a smile, "It's just over an hour of battle. It seems that these orcs-affiliated tribes have poor fighting power." He sighed. Not long after, Beer came back. He saluted, "Sir, we have captured nearly 1,000 prisoners. What do you plan to do with it?" Ross pointed to the place where he fought before and said, "I plan to build a city by the river, and then dig a trench to introduce the water from the river as a moat. The river where they are located is 7 or 8 meters wide and the depth is unknown. It's really a good location." Ross continued, "I can't let my soldiers do the work of farmers. These captives will then become slaves to build castles." Beer saluted, "Your Excellency is wise." After that, he began to command his subordinates, divide all the prisoners into teams, and then manage a team by one person. As for Ross, he started spending money on materials needed for construction such as wood. The wood produced by the system is different, some are finished products, and some are still raw materials. The finished wood side costs 1 gold coin, while the raw material side only needs half a gold coin. The walls of the castle must first be made of raw materials, and the houses in the castle must be made of finished wood. Ross doesn't know how much wood he needs. He can only buy some raw wood first and let the prisoners carry them to build the walls. The remaining part of the prisoners began to dig trenches. In order to make them more efficient, Ross spent dozens of gold coins to buy a batch of tools. Until the sun went down, the walls of a wooden village had been erected, and arrow towers had been erected in 3 directions. As for the trench, it was only less than 100 meters long, and not even one side was dug. But fortunately, there is a wall, which can be regarded as a sense of security. The first night in the wasteland was over, and early in the morning, the slaves began to work under the supervision of their soldiers. Ross said to Beer, "Yesterday, the affiliated tribes of the orcs fought against us. I am afraid it is a temptation. Now the enemy already knows our approximate strength, but we still don't know the situation of the other party. Beer, bring a few people with you and explore the surrounding area. It is best to inquire about the news of the orc tribe." At Rose's order, Beer immediately took someone and headed west. Ross turned on the system. There was a map interface in the system. Only the places he walked through would be displayed on the system map. Otherwise, it would be darkness. Now he watched as Beer's team stretched out in the dark west of the map. To the west of him were mostly plains and a few hills, and those hills were low hills. The tall ones are only about 100 meters high, the short ones are only about 70 to 80 meters, the foot of the mountain is 10 to 20 miles in diameter, and the top of the mountain stretches together like a mountain. As for the plains, they saw pastures and fields for growing wheat. Not far away, there were tribes scattered with tents, which looked like a small tribe. Beer ran over to take a look, and someone in the tribe ran out with an axe, and some threw javelins or shot arrows. Fortunately, Beer and the others escaped in time, otherwise they would not even have people and horses. Withdraw. Beer could see that the other party was very powerful. He looked at the inhabitants of the tribe who rushed out just now, and he seemed to know that they were orcs. On the map that Ross watched, it showed the Green Flag tribe, and there were many tribes of goblins, and kobolds around. And the tribe that Ross defeated yesterday was the one closest to them were the Howling clan of goblins, the Greenskin Taller clan of goblin, and the Black Nose clan of kobolds. Today, all the small and medium tribes are displayed on the map, and the large tribe of orcs has not yet been displayed. Then he saw Beer and the others running back. Half an hour later, Beer came back with a few cavalry, and he immediately reported the situation of the nearby tribes to Ross. Although he did not detect the large tribe of orcs, he had already checked out the surrounding tribes. Although there is a tribe of orcs, it is now the end of July, and the orcs generally will not be dispatched until the beginning of September. During this period, there will probably only be kobolds and goblins nearby to harass them. Although it is said that there is a month, but the time is still relatively tight. He must build the wooden village and dig a moat within a month. Relying on nearly 1,000 slaves, time was tight, and Ross immediately thought of going to the frontier fortress of the Kaitar kingdom to buy slaves. There are many kingdoms and empires in the central continent. Due to wars or natural and man-made disasters, many people have been arrested as slaves, and some have gone bankrupt and cannot afford to pay and are sold as slaves. Most of the slave markets that sell coolies are in the frontier fortresses. Only handsome men and women, ordinary goods are sold in some prosperous cities in Middle-earth. He immediately exchanged his military exploits for gold coins, and then left Beer and 2 knights, as well as 200 infantry soldiers, and he led a large army to the frontier fortress. When Ross led the army through the Courtesy territory, the local Lord William Courtenance was watching from not far away. William looked at Ross passing by in surprise, and said, "Isn't he alone before? How come there is such an elite team all of a sudden, at least the direct force of an earl? It seems that we have all been deceived. We have to tell Prince George about this matter. This news will definitely surprise him. Then we can negotiate with Prince George." Ross saw William, but he ignored it. He didn't know that William was trying to use him as a bargaining chip to blackmail George. George is Ross' eldest brother, and when George takes the throne, he will be George 15. Ross did not stop all the way. He walked for 5 days before he arrived at the border fortress. Because he brought the army, the fortress sent knights to come at the first time. The knight held a red flag and stopped Ross's army, but he saw that the flag was the flag of the royal family of Keter, but the background color was different. He said respectfully, "Sir, your army can only be stationed outside the city." Ross nodded and said, "I see." Led by a knight, Ross's army found a place to camp outside the city. And Ross entered the city with only a few knights and 10 squires. After Ross entered the city, he went straight to the slave market. He was now short of time. The round-trip time was 10 days, and there were not many days left before the orcs came. In the slave market, the best sellers are the colts, who are very strong and good at fighting. Next are the Uemanians. They are hard-working, and very suitable for being farmers. As for the others, it is not as obvious as these 2 types of advantages. However, these 2 types of slaves are relatively expensive, and 1 gold coin can only buy 2 or 3 people. Ross exchanged 1,000 gold coins this time. He spent 500 gold coins to buy 5 Pielts and 600 Moonmanians. With 500 gold coins left, he bought clothes, shoes, and other things, as well as pots and pans, as well as more than a dozen carriages. He temporarily kept the remaining money. Ross delivered the goods with the merchants on the spot, and then left the market with the slaves and went outside the city. Such a long line attracted the attention of pedestrians, and some of the colts wanted to escape, but the slaves were all tied together and could not escape at all. Although Ross couldn't bear to do this, he couldn't soften his heart at this time. After all, his life was the most important thing. He took the slaves to his army's station, and he stood on a high place and said to a group of slaves, "I know you are not willing to be slaves, you should be the best warriors and the best farmers. I don't want to treat you as slaves either, but we are in the wasteland and must be united in order to survive in this wasteland. As long as you work hard for me, I will restore your status as a free man based on your contribution and work attitude. Not only that, I will also help you to start a family and start a business, and you will be rewarded for your military exploits. In the first 3 years of farming, your land will be yours, and after that, the land will belong to you." Hearing Rose's promise, both the colts and the Moonmanians were excited. They felt that they had seen hope, but some people felt that it was not credible. The commoners naturally did not believe in nobles. And the reason why Ross did this is to build his own territory. Slaves will not bring prosperity to a castle, but free people can. After Ross said these words, on the way back, the slaves stopped making trouble. Although some people didn't believe it, most people still wanted to see the authenticity of all this. Because there were a bunch of slaves who couldn't eat or sleep well in the market, of course Ross couldn't rush back within 5 days, but after Ross knew the problem, he immediately adjusted the slaves' food. This time, the slaves ate better than before, and they also ate meat. This time, many people believed that what Ross said before was true. Because Ross changed the meals of the slaves walked much faster and complained less. This made their team a lot faster, and in the end it only took 7 days to return to Muzai. In the days when Ross left Muzai, some kobolds came to investigate, and Beer immediately sent cavalry to investigate around. After the kobolds went back to investigate the news, there were no signs of sending troops from the affiliated tribes, but Beer did not let down his guard, and sent people to inquire about the news every day. Now that Ross came back with thousands of people, Beer felt a lot more relaxed. With the participation of these 1,100 human slaves, the construction of Muzai has accelerated by more than a few dollars, and the consumption of food has also accelerated. Fortunately, he had savings before, and the food supply was not tight. 15 days later, the wooden village in Ross's plan finally had a basic appearance. This wooden village was built along the moat, with a length and width of 200 meters, and a total area of more than 40,000 square meters. UU reading www.uuganshu.com. On the side of the wall, there is a horse face every 10 meters, that is, a protruding section, so that you can shoot arrows at the enemy below the city wall. After the construction of the Muzai, Ross's system has changed. His system interface does not enter the task system, and the building page has also been unlocked. Ross opened the task, become a real lord and own a castle of your own, note, stone fort. Mission reward, the number of recruits has been increased to 1,500, and the Roman legion, the Spartan King's Guard, and the Greek heavy infantry phalanx will be unlocked. Ross saw this task, and his head was big. This stone castle not only required money, but also required a lot of time and manpower. The task was difficult. The most important thing at the moment is to resist the autumn attack of the orc tribe. Ross put his mind away, he clicked on the building page to check, and found a building in the main city that unlocked the castle, not only the castle, but also the built-in military camp, blacksmith shop, lumber mill, warehouse, and other buildings. And the castle in the system, the lowest one, is just about the same size as the Rosewood village, and the cost is 18,000 gold coins. And Ross himself still had 1,550 military exploits and 4,500 gold coins. He didn't hesitate to exchange the gold coins and bought the cheapest castle. The system immediately prompted, the castle can be placed. When Ross was excited, he immediately placed the castle, and when the light flashed, he stood in the hall. The task is completed, and the reward has been issued. Mission: an earl's territory is at least 500 square kilometers, please expand your territory. Mission reward: 1,000 military exploits, unlocking the Knights Templar, the English longbowmen. Ross was stunned for a moment. After waking up from the excitement just now, he seemed to be exposed. When many slaves bought back by Ross saw the castle rising out of thin air, they were shocked. Is it a miracle? Wow! When thousands of slaves saw this, they all fell to their knees. All the knights also crawled on the ground, looking up at the figure of Ross who was aloof. Even the squire knights who followed Ross couldn't help but sigh that Ross's financial resources are really rich. Some knights in the original establishment complained a lot about Ross's continuous expansion of slaves. You must know, how can an ordinary lord be so generous as Ross, and a castle will rise from the ground at every turn. Ross showed a calm smile, then opened his hands. Okay, let's all get up. I hope everyone can contribute to the construction of the city. Everyone got up, and all looked at Ross with admiration. Ross looked at the desolate plain in front of him. Barracks and stockades had gradually begun to spread out. Together with the castle he just exchanged, it took up 1/15 of the area of the plain. Ross smiled contentedly. At least, the 5 Balts bought from the slave market and the 600 Manians have a place to live. The next step is to strengthen the fortifications around the castle to prepare for the attack of the orcs on the autumn equinox. In order to complete the task, Ross plans to expand the territory next. At present, together with the conscription and the colts, the Monomanians, the army under Ross has exceeded 2,000. In order to quickly expand the plan to reclaim the wasteland, Ruskin beat the gongs and drums to mobilize the Monomanians to serve as farmers. And 600 colts have become powerful troops, serving as human shields in battle. After all, the best sellers in the slave market are the colts. Their physical strength is almost the same as that of the squire knights. Once trained a little, it only takes a short time to become one of the main troops in the army. And the 500 Monthold Manian, hardworking, is very suitable for being a farmer. With the participation of farmers, Ross's reclamation of wasteland has accelerated significantly. At this time, Ross thought that it was time to buy materials again. I bought a batch of arrow towers for the soldiers to carry materials to build the arrow towers. 1 arrow tower was built in each of the 3 directions of the north, east and west. For better observation, each arrow tower was also required to be equipped with a watchtower. Because the purchase of the castle cost a lot of military merit, Ross thought about it and decided to buy the watchtower made of the cheapest wood. Watchtower, 200 military merit. Ross glanced at the system page, and he just had 600 military merit left, which was left over when he beat the kobold. Exchange all. Wow! The 3 watchtowers were built in 3 directions, and with the arrow tower only 15 meters away, Ross immediately arranged 15 archers to patrol. I made a special trip to see if there were any enemies coming 1,000 meters away. Once the enemy is spotted, Ross can make decisions minutes in advance. At this time, busy peasants and exercising soldiers found the watchtower rising from the ground, and had already expressed their complete crawl for this miracle. Ross thought, it's too troublesome, these guys haven't seen the big world at first glance. With a wave of his hand, Ross manipulated the options on the system page. Click brainwashing on top of every profession. The next second, the respected large group of people who were crawling on the ground continued to be busy. Ross said with a gratified smile, that's right. Only by never stopping can productivity become stronger. Otherwise, I would be surrounded by these guys every time I put things. The visit is a visit, and the production will stop. The sun is getting hotter and hotter, baking on the whole uncovered ground. In less than an hour, several able-bodied farmers suffered from heat stroke. Ross was arranging for people to command and reinforce the watchtower. Seeing this, he made everyone stop their work. Use the remaining wood to build a medical house. Ross said to several commanding teams, and hundreds of knights responded at the same time, Master is wise. The hundreds of knights gave orders to their captives at the same time, and the thousands of captives immediately continued to work on the construction of the medical house. Ross used the remaining military merit to buy some wood, and the prisoners were responsible for transporting them. Another part of the prisoners who dug the ditches was also called over to reinforce the watchtowers, and the rest began to build medical houses. After the medical house is built, people who faint from time to time can go in, and they can recover their strength and start working in a short time, and their productivity will skyrocket. On the other side, some of the peasants who were cultivating began to fall down for some unknown reason. Ross was a little puzzled. Could it be that there is a miasma in this wasteland? Sure enough, there was a real miasma. Because, the system shows that what is on their heads is, I was stunned by the miasma, and it will take 3 hours to wake up. Ross was a little bit stumped by this miasma. He didn't know how to deal with the miasma. This thing is equivalent to the plague-level malaria. Once it spreads in the army, the damage can range from 1,000 to 800. At this time, the soldiers on the watchtower who were in charge of scouting out the wall shouted, "There are orcs 1,000 meters away, there are 100, and they are gradually approaching." 100 orcs appeared 1,000 meters away. There are more than 100 orcs 1,000 meters away. News of the orcs came from all three directions. Yu reading www.yuugonshu.com. Ross thought, isn't it more than 10 days away from the autumnal equinox? Is this to test him? Good. Then let you test the truth. All archers collectively go to the watchtower and shoot arrows. The reason why Ross built the watchtower is not just to detect the enemy, but more importantly, the watchtower with a sudden height increase, which can improve most of the archers' range than the city wall. Ross gave an order, and in less than 5 minutes, the top of the watchtower was filled with archers. There are 40 archers standing on each watchtower, and the limited space is used in an orderly manner to ensure that each archer has a complete field of vision. Ross checked the location, and when he was 800 meters away, he ordered to shoot arrows. 800 meters is the longest range for an archer. Swish! Suddenly, the sky was instantly filled with black arrows, which appeared above the heads of the orcs a few seconds later. Dangerous! Raise your shield! The orc leader inadvertently looked up and saw the sharp arrows flying towards them, and quickly commanded his subordinates to raise the wooden shield in their hands. However, apart from the orc leader, no one noticed the missing arrow in the air, and many orcs were shot to death by an arrow before they could defend themselves. Hush! There are as many as 30 orcs who were shot through a certain part of the body, but did not die immediately. What kind of bow and arrow can shoot so far? The orc leader couldn't think of it, he just wanted to quietly explore the realities of the nearby lords, and was slapped heathen. I didn't see it until later. It turned out that 3 watchtowers, 100 meters high, had been built near the castle. The orc leader suddenly realized. It turned out that the Ross territory had long guessed that the orcs would send people to test them, and built watchtowers before they attacked. It is specially aimed at the junior orcs with strong melee ability. There are very few mid-level orcs in the vicinity, and even the leader of the 100 orcs is the best among the junior orcs. Retreat! The orc leader raised the big sword in his hand and roared wildly. The roar echoed back from the scattered army. When the orcs in the last row heard it, they immediately turned around and ran towards the orc territory. Ross showed a smile and ordered, "All archers, don't let an orc go. Open the door, all light knights charge." Knights are divided into light and heavy. Because Ross had no money to buy light knights, he had to buy 30 sets of light equipment for those knights who were good at charging. Everyone, kill an army of orcs and reward them with 5 silver coins. All the knights jumped up. The purchasing power of 5 silver coins in this world is equivalent to a month's wages for a commoner. And the more you kill, the more you get. When it's time to go to the city and spend time drinking, girls will never be short of money again. When Ross said this, of course, it played a role in motivating and encouraging. 100 orcs were trampled over their bodies within 10 minutes by the horses of archers and light knights. Soon, the system prompted him to obtain 300 military exploits. This time, it can be exchanged for 3,000 gold coins. Ross immediately exchanged hundreds of logs and asked farmers to continue strengthening the wooden village. Immediately, hundreds of farmers began to work diligently. In a few hours, Ross will be able to upgrade the wooden village to a mid-level fortification. The reason for this rush is because Ross guessed that the orc tribe will know that there is no one left, and Ross has killed them all. Thus, a more powerful official army was sent to attack the tribe of Russ. However, an orc's combat power is equivalent to a dozen humans, and even a low-level orc needs 2 squire knights to fight. 100 orcs were wiped out by Ross so quickly, they would definitely send thousands of orcs to be ashamed. The orcs around here are the enemies that Ross needs to solve the most in the near future. Therefore, Ross had to prepare as early as possible. With his current strength, he was simply not capable of defeating the attack of thousands of orcs. At this time, Ross checked his strength. 1,300 slaves, people from the slave market, have been trained to be peasants and soldiers. In addition to this, there were 200 retinue knights, 800 ordinary knights, 100 archers, 600 peasants, and 500 infantry. Ross's first reaction was to increase the number of infantrymen, so that he could form a formation to fight the orc army with ingenuity without having to fight with them recklessly. A heavy cavalry requires 40 gold coins, which includes his equipment and horses. A heavy infantry requires 20 gold coins, a medium infantry 10 gold coins, an archer hardware coins, and 10 infantry 1 gold coins. After Ross purchased several hundred pieces of wood to upgrade the wooden village, he still had 1,000 gold coins left. Ross glanced at the 3 watchtowers, and the reinforced watchtower also instructed them to reinforce the deck above so that more archers could stand on it. Ross decisively purchased 100 archers and 1,000 infantry. Then the price of heavy infantry is 250 times that of ordinary infantry. One heavy infantry can buy more than 200 infantry. Ross felt a little distressed. Decided to bypass the heavy infantry temporarily and bought the medium infantry with a slightly cheaper price. 50 medium infantry. With the remaining 400 gold coins, Ross showed a smile and clicked to buy 4 wooden throwing vehicles. Then ordered all farmers to start building shields after completing the defense upgrade. The size of the shield must cover the bulk of the throwing cart, preventing the throwing cart from being remotely attacked by the orcs. After all this was done, the Black Orc army soon attacked the fortifications with a mighty force. The leader is a man who looks different from other low-level orcs. It has penetrating fangs on its mouth, and the appearance of sharp-mouthed monkey cheeks is very ugly and terrifying. Holding an iron rod, he ran straight ahead. Quest: kill a mid-level orc, reward 800 battle exploits and 2,000 gold coins. Every time you kill a low-level orc, you can get 10 points of combat credit. Rose's eyes lit up, and the orcs 1,000 meters away turned into golden coins in his eyes. He never thought before that orcs are so valuable, and the battle points for killing a low-level orc are 10 times as much as killing a goblin. Then Ross announced the opening of the wall door, and rows of soldiers charged out. Ross looked at them. The soldiers were not going to fight the orcs recklessly. Because 10 ordinary soldiers can kill an orc, Ross told their leading soldier in advance. Not long ago, Ross made more than a dozen squire knights serve as the centurions of these soldiers. Each squire knight is in charge of 100 soldiers, teaching them simple formations, waiting for the orc army to be beaten at a loss, and taking this opportunity to surround them in one fell swoop. Fill the arrows. The orc army began to charge in a mighty manner, and Ross ordered them to start shooting arrows. As expected by Ross, when the archers on the watchtower began to shoot arrows, the orcs seemed to be already equipped, and each taller orc interspersed in the army raised a huge shield in their hands. With the advantage of being tall and strong, and the huge shield, each shield hand can shelter 5 or 6 orcs. Some sharp arrows flew through the air at a 45-degree angle. Thousands of sharp arrows shot past in seconds. The soldiers looked at them, but these sharp arrows only killed less than 20 orcs. In an instant, the army of orcs exploded. Kill! Burn down these human camps! The orcs roared. The charging figure did not show any signs of subtraction, even in a rain of arrows. Soon, half of the tens of thousands of arrows were shot by the archers. Ross shouted in time, "Stop shooting! Launch the throwing cart and load the flint!" Dozens of peasants quickly pushed the huge throwing cart with 4 chubby reels out of the wall and lined up in a row. The wall gate was pushed out by the Roshian knights early on to build the stone wall. There are hundreds of stone blocks high in one person. Ross asked them to wrap some clothes around the stone, and then set the clothes on fire to throw flint. Just because Ross looked at it, Buying burning gunpowder cost at least 5,000 gold coins, and it was a one-time use, so he paid attention. Launch! The night beer roared, and then more than a dozen knights cut off the ropes tied to the rear of the throwing cart, and the front end was filled with heavy objects and fell instantly, quickly throwing the stones on the other side into the air dozens of meters high. In the midst of it, it blasted towards the center of the orc army without error. Looking at the flaming boulder rolling down from the sky, the orcs waved their thick arms and thighs at the same time, struggling to raise the huge shield in their hands. With a loud bang, the center of the mighty army of 1,000 orcs was suddenly smashed into a huge pit by a dozen falling boulders. There were dozens of them. A man-high boulder fell, killing more than 30 powerful orcs. And the hot flames continued to spread. Seeing that more than 10 orcs were burned alive, more than a dozen orcs were smashed and the hard skin of dozens of orcs was burned. Ross watched all this with a smile, and the moment he threw the cart and the stone turned the tide of the battle. Ross saw that the military heart of the orcs had suddenly dropped from 100% to 80%. With the order of the Knight Commander Beer, the hundreds of peasants who were responsible for carrying the stones filled the throwing carts again and launched them. Each of the throwing vehicles Ross purchased can carry 5 boulders as tall as one person. It can also be loaded with about 30 rounds of standard throwing stones, but that kind of lethality can only be fatal to humans. For orcs, you have to use the largest stone and wrap it in flames to beat them in the face. Swish swish! Another 40 rounds of huge stones were wrapped in flames and fell, and the army of orcs who raised their shields was directly killed by a single blow. Seeing this situation, those orcs who were arranged to raise their shields dropped their shields and discarded their armors, fleeing everywhere. But the flames in the army had spread all over, and the orc leader ordered, "Hurry up and put out the fire." But at this moment, the fire has spread fiercely, and the scattered orcs were rewrapped in, and they were roasted to the color of suckling pigs in less than 2 minutes. Damn! This actually owns a throwing cart. The leader of the orcs, the only mid-level orc in the army, thought in disbelief. Why did the throwing cart, a weapon used to fight wars of 10,000 people, appear on a lord who was not even reached by a small count? Could it be a wasteland lord from the royal family? Impossible. How could the royal people take out only 4 throwing carts, at least 5 times the number? The orc lord's name is Liase. He had participated in the war to destroy a small kingdom before, and made great achievements. Retreat! Liase tried his best to roar, but there was no answer from the orcs. Because at this moment, the sky is once again filled with dense rockets, as well as slightly smaller but denser stones. Suddenly, thousands of rockets were fired without gaps. Rias wanted to order the team to find cover, only to find that there was no cover at all nearby, only the endless plains and the hills in the distance. It is impossible to escape to the hills, because it is several kilometers away. It was almost impossible to retreat to the throwing carts and archers, because Ross did not directly attack when he saw them, but let the orc army approach 800 meters before launching rounds of shots. And the throwing vehicle has a range of at least 1,500 meters. At this time, hundreds of orcs fell one after the other and became a corpse. Riase couldn't wait any longer, and if this progress continued, the orc army that suffered heavy losses would be wiped out within an hour. Ross smiled and glanced at the military heart of the orcs. Only less than 60% remained. This time, the orc army was more tenacious than Ross imagined. If it were to be placed on ordinary goblins, the army's heart would have been broken long ago. Note: the leader of the orcs activates the skills, and the army is united. It can instantly condense the army of orcs into 100% military heart in a short period of time, and launch a charge. Ross looked at the mid-level orc in disbelief and fell into thought. At this time, even if the orcs launched a charge, Ross had a 50% certainty that he would use the knights in medium suits and more than 1,000 infantry to surround the orcs' army that was incapable of strength. So Ross ordered the throwing vehicles to return to the fortifications, and all the infantry and medium knights went out to battle. Soon, as the last wave of arrows shot and killed more than a dozen orcs with thick scalps, more than 1,000 infantrymen and 200 knights in medium armor, and the army of orcs started torn apart. But after a while, it became clear that the physical strength of human beings began to go bad. It takes 10 infantrymen to strangle an orc, and a knight in middle suits can beat a wounded orc. Ross's vanguard was gradually exhausted, but the knights in medium began to look for an entry point to surround the orc army, trying to surround these orcs. With a bang, an orc with a big axe was slashed to death by Bobber. Immediately afterwards, the knights in medium attire on horses, each leading dozens of following infantrymen, completely surrounded the orc army. Just as they were about to tear a hole and break through, Ross smiled and waved his hand, signaling the archers inside the fortification to shoot. The rain of rockets instantly hit every orc trying to get out of the encirclement, and an average of 3 arrows could kill a low-level orc. Ross has long thought of this step. After the watchtower is reinforced, it can accommodate all his archers, and the height of 100 meters can accurately kill all orcs within 800 meters. In an instant, all the orcs were like trapped beasts, madly weakened by Ross's troops. An hour later, the last orc leader was also cut off his disgusting head with a sword. Ross rewarded the soldiers who cut off the heads of intermediate orcs heavily and was promoted to Squire Knight. Complete the quest, kill a mid-level orc. Reward, 1,000 gold coins, 800 military exploits. Ross inevitably showed a hint of excitement. He began to calculate the outcome of this battle in his heart. A total of 780 orcs were killed, including the orcs who died after being seriously injured, and those who were burned to 9th-degree burns, and were killed by Bobber. 780 heads, converted into military exploits, is 2,340 combat exploits. Plus the reward, Ross has a total of 3,140 points of military exploits. With a big wave of his hand, he bought 8 more throwing vehicles starting at 200 gold coins, and bought a lot of building materials for expanding the territory and strengthening the stone walls. It cost 800 gold coins in an instant. Ross looked at the facility again and found a functional building that required 2,000 military exploits, a blacksmith shop. With a big wave of Ross's hand, a building with an area of less than 200 square meters rose from the ground. As soon as Ross entered the door, he wrote a series of numbers: weapons, long swords, 5 gold coins. Gun, 8 gold coins, shield, 6 gold coins. Ross immediately exchanged 1,000 military exploits for 10,000 gold coins. 500 shields and 600 guns were built. It is far cheaper to build weapons at a blacksmith shop than Ross directly buys them, at least half the price. There are still 3,000 gold coins and 140 military exploits left. Ross then came to the barracks again. And the system prompted again: whether the military camp is upgraded, ordinary civilians can be recruited after the upgrade. Ross saw that it would take 100 military credits to upgrade the barracks, and immediately upgraded the barracks. The brand new barracks has set up an expansion office, but Ross's territory has not yet been recruited under the same name. Ross immediately instructed a few squire knights who were with him, and ordered to prepare 200 knights in medium attire and 50 squire knights to accompany Ross to the slave market. Ross walked out of the stone fortress and glanced at the facilities around the territory outside. That's right, it looks very solid. I guess those orcs won't be able to get in for 3 hours. Ross said in a joking tone. Bobber, who was behind him, followed Rose's gaze, with a tone of admiration, as expected of the master. Even the time of the stone wall defense is so accurate. Ross smiled, got up and walked out of the stone wall gate, followed by 200 knights. When passing through the plain, Ross passed by William's territory, and when William glanced at him, a dangerous smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. I read that right, he actually held the big sword of the orc leader. After Bobber beheaded the leader of the orcs, he dedicated his side weapon to Ross. And when William saw it, he said incredulously, This means that Ross defeated an orc tribe nearby. William has lived here for half his life, and the territorial tribe has only developed to the point where it can barely contain the orcs. Knowing that Ross defeated a small orc nearby and was not behind, William flashed a dangerous alert in his eyes. Ross ignored him and rode a group of brown-black horses directly around the edge of William's territory. Since the owner of the territory did not come out to say hello, Ross must be unwelcome, and there is no need for Ross to make fun of himself. After Ross walked away, William looked at Ross's disappearing back and murmured, "His Royal Highness, it seems that only by joining forces can we kill him." A figure walked out of the bushes next to it, wearing a royal cloak, and looking at it extravagantly, it looked like a royal. The second prince said disdainfully, "I'll go back immediately and give you 2 royal knights, 2 artillery regiments, 8 throwing vehicles, 10,000 rounds of ammunition, 1,000 rounds of artillery, and 500 rounds of bolter ammunition." As soon as William heard this, he slumped on the ground, and a deep excitement flashed in his eyes. "With these supplies, I will take down the Ross territory in 3 days, and then dedicate it to you." William had never seen such a strong team in his life. The 2 royal knights had 2,000 people, and the artillery regiment had 400 people each. Although the number is not invincible, the Royal Knights are one of the best troops in the world, and their power is at least 5 times that of ordinary armored knights. And the Royal Knights are all 1 to 100. Therefore, William is very confident that he can instantly defeat the entire Ross tribe and capture Ross territory. What Ross didn't know was that a crisis was lurking behind. Report: a few knights exploring the path found 15 goblins ahead. Do you want to kill them? Ross is counting his captives. After the last battle against the orcs, the surrounding orcs also lost a lot of his strength. A total of 80 knights in medium armor and 800 infantry were lost. In fact, the loss of these 800 infantry was only enough for Ross to buy 7 knights in medium armor. Although Ross made a special trip to make up for these losses after the war, he still did a rough calculation and concluded that infantry is really useful. The array method needs to be improved. If it weren't for the fact that Ross could only have a maximum of 1,500 troops, he would directly buy 10,000 infantry with 1,000 gold coins. 15 goblins, where are they? Ross asked. Under the bushes on both sides of the bushes, it seems like, patrolling. Ross thought for a while. In this case, it is very likely that there is an entire goblin tribe nearby, but why are those goblins hiding their heads and showing their tails? Could it be, what important base is being built? Go find a few stalwart knights who are more capable, and find out the goblin army. Ross brought a lot of troops out this time to prevent such emergencies. As long as you find the goblin army, or have clues, you will be rewarded with 10 silver coins. 10 coins are equivalent to 1/10 of gold coins, which is the income of the commoners for 1 quarter. After hearing the news from the knights, they all wanted to go, but the knights who were loyal to Ross were all very disciplined and well trained, and they quickly selected 5 with the strongest stealth ability. Ross clicked on the personal attributes of the 5 people. The privacy is a bit higher than other knights. Ross nodded and said, "Go ahead and report back as soon as there is news." Ross stood in the middle of the queue and waited for about 15 minutes, when suddenly several figures of goblins were bound and thrown in. Ross didn't kill them, he wanted to torture them. Treating this group of monsters, Ross showed no mercy. He drew a knife to the neck of a goblin and asked, "Is your army building something near here?" The goblin gritted his teeth and said, "No." But the goblin beside it said, "Yes." The 2 voices entered Ross's ears at the same time. Ross smiled and cut off the head of the goblin next to him with a knife. "Yes, let's use this as a farmer." Ross let go of the spineless goblin, and turned to ask the last goblin, "How many people are in your army, and the exact location?" "There are 300 of them in total. They are about 200 meters deep on the left side of the goblin forest in front. The Lord is building an extremely powerful weapon." After speaking, the goblins were dragged down and taken away to act as farmers. Ross showed a smile and led the army to the place where the intelligence said. The reason why the forest in front is called the Goblin Forest is because this small forest is only 500 square kilometers, and there are no less than 8 goblin lords. Ross looked at the bustling figures of a dozen goblins tens of meters ahead, carrying a hanging tower tied with stones and hemp ropes, thinking, this time, I have found a treasure. The fixed catapult is several times more powerful than the throwing cart. The only disadvantage is that it is easy to expose the position, and it cannot be easily moved due to its huge weight. Ross looked further afield. At least 10 such fixed catapults were built in the dense jungle a few hundred meters away. It seems that one of these goblin lords spent all his troops building these weapons, which should be to cleanse all the nearby goblin tribes and become a veritable king of goblin. With Ross's death, more than a dozen knights in medium attire went straight to these goblins. Before their screams could summon their companions, their green throats were cut by a dagger, and they died. When the goblins who were a few hundred meters away noticed something strange, Ross's knight in medium had successfully circled and surrounded it. In this way, the 10 temporary goblin bases were all destroyed in 3 ways by the same soldiers. Only 10 fixed catapults were left, which were fixed under the ground. Ross looked up at the top of the catapults. These catapults were 30 meters high, and the hemp ropes were only tens of meters long, and the range was able to cover the entire goblin forest. Ross was a little surprised. What strength did these goblin armies have to build such a magnificent and lethal weapon? And once you start, there are 10 seats. Ross looked at the attributes and shook his hand slightly. Catapult, level 3 range, 5 kilometers loading capacity, 50 stone per person high. Ross roughly calculated that the range and loading capacity of this catapult are 5 times that of a throwing vehicle. In other words, if you use the slinger to deal with the previous army of 1,000 orcs, you only need one, and you don't need to send an army to encircle the orcs. The sling can automatically load stones, and you only need to keep slinging to avoid a large number of casualties. Ross instantly felt that he had made a lot of money. The reason why these goblins are built in the depths of these scattered dense forests is that they are afraid of being discovered by the lords of the territories dozens of kilometers nearby. Ross instructed, set up camp here, and this will be our second territory in the future. Bobber was just about to say that the neighborhood was full of dangers and there were an astonishing number of goblins, but he saw Ross wave his hand gently. Report, I found the place where the goblin hid the ammunition. There are a total of 500 stones high in one person, 1,000 pieces of stone ammunition 30 centimeters in size, and 50 packs of explosives. When Ross heard this, his eyes lit up. Explosive packs? Do these goblins have such good things? Make arrangements to ambush these explosive packs in these places in batches. Ross took out a pen and a map. I made more than a dozen laps, which are the necessary places for the kingdom to lead to the territory of Ross. Ross could predict that his brother would definitely find an opportunity to deal with him, so it would be better to bury explosives in the place where he must pass now. At this time, another squire knight came and said, Lord, you can see that goblins are constantly coming over here. Ross said, everyone, prepare to fight. 20 knights in medium armor are arranged next to each sling, and they must be defended. The reason why Ross divided the entire team of more than 200 people into 10 teams was precisely because of the power of these slings. Within a few minutes, as expected by Ross, these goblins rushed into the vicinity of the forest, and Ross noticed that they were in groups of 3 or 5, looking for something like headless flies. Quickly find the catapults and the explosives they hide. A goblin leader said with a grin. Ross smiled and arranged for all the catapults to start attacking them. There were also dozens of knights arranged by Ross to drag the ammunition back, and there was not much ammunition on the catapult at the moment. But at the same time launching such a magnificent large-scale sling, almost all of a sudden, the hundreds of goblins that were not far apart were drowned by hundreds of boulders, and they didn't even have time to scream. Ross checked the military merit with satisfaction. Each goblin can gain a little bit of military merit, which is far inferior to that of the orcs. Military merit, 80 plus 250 soon. Other tribes in the goblin forest heard the sound and began to move around. Although the goblin forest was more than 10 square kilometers, the terrain was relatively flat. Ross ordered his knights to attack, and 10 knight squads began. He kept standing on the large catapult, and threw rocks in the direction the goblin dispatched frantically. Suddenly, dozens of boulders killed a lot of goblins with short stature and IQ arrears. Military merit plus 500 mission, destroy all the goblin tribes in the goblin forest, a total of 13,800 heads. Reward, 13,800 military exploits, 50 Irish archers. Ross is very interested in these military exploits. In this forest, there are more than 10,000 goblins. Ross only brought more than 200 people. Soon, Ross ordered 2 messengers to go back in time to lead 2,000 infantry and 100 archers. But it will take at least an hour to make it here. The charge knight also needs about 20 minutes. After all, Ross also wanted to make phone calls, but the level of technology was far from that level. However, due to the various obstacles in the forest, it was difficult for the goblin, whose IQ was already in arrears, to find the exact location of Ross's troops. Basically, you can only rely on the flying stones in the sky to judge the direction. However, because the 10 catapults were built far away, they surrounded half of the goblin forest directly to the east, and stones kept pouring in, and most of these stones could hit several goblins. UU reading www.uuganshu.com. The huge number of goblins contributed to the situation where a lot of them were killed at once. But Ross noticed the change in the goblins in time, and several groups of goblins began to spread out gradually. The goblin leader activates the skill, let go of the past. It turns out that these leaders are the lords of their respective territories. When they encounter such a situation, they will resolutely merge into one race, which will increase the threat to Ross in a straight line. Wow wow! Groups of green goblins wearing ancient costumes and holding Stone Age axes rushed into the moving side of the goblin forest frantically. After the original goblin army was destroyed by Ross, became a vacancy. Now, all the goblins rushed towards this side at the same time, and the pressure of tens of thousands of goblins was swept away immediately. Ross did not have a large army to intercept their attacks, so he had to continue to let the slings attack. The goblin who is currently rushing in front is still 300 meters away from Ross, and another 200 meters is where Ross is ambushing his explosives. These explosives are linked together. Once one explodes, dozens of explosive packs around it will also explode along with it. Boom! One of the goblins in the army stepped on the lead, and Ross immediately ignited the lead, and in less than a minute of burning time, a large number of goblins rushed into the explosion area. Boom! At one point in the goblin forest, there was a loud bombardment. Thousands of goblins were all destroyed by the explosion of gunpowder, and they were suddenly destroyed into ashes. 700 or 800 goblins were burned and fell to the ground, panting heavily. The loss is more than 1/5, and the goblin leader's skill, release the suspicion. Ross smiled. Because the loss has exceeded 20%, the skills of the goblin leader were directly forcibly touched. After the skill disappeared, the huge army of goblins was suddenly headless, bumping around and smashing their heads and blood. All the goblins were different, and the goblins of various tribes gradually gathered together. At this time, half of the explosives buried by Ross had been blown up, and half of the explosives had been ambushed on the only way from the kingdom to the territory of Ross. This half of the explosives were used by Ross to deal with the goblins. Seeing that the goblins were dying, Ross said, "All out attack!" Pong! The large catapult followed with a massive kill. The dense stone blocks directly killed this large group of goblins, and several groups of goblins fled around, but it was impossible to escape from Ross's range. Because that small tribe built these large catapults here, it was confident that they could kill all the goblins. Bang bang bang! After a few minutes, half of the goblin army was killed before they could escape, and 5,000 goblin army had died tragically in the goblin forest. Military merit, 5,500 Ross exchanged 1,000 military merits for 10,000 gold coins, and then bought 300 archers, 2,000 infantrymen and some materials for the construction of the base camp, with 9,000 gold coins left. Bang bang bang! Under the constant attack, the scattered forces of the goblins had already run out of the range of Ross's large catapult, and they began to set up camp a few kilometers away, ready to counterattack at any time. Ross arranged for 50 retinue knights to lead 1,500 infantry to clear out all the goblins within 1 kilometer outside the sling. Then he got up again, and after the situation stabilized, he continued to get up and head to the slave market. Since we had already walked most of the way, the goblin forest was not far from the slave market. After walking for 20 minutes, we rode there on horseback. The knight held the red flag and stopped Ross's army. He saw that the flag was the flag of the royal family of Keter. He said respectfully, "Sir, your army can only be stationed outside the city." Ross still had the troops stationed outside. Ross spent 400 gold coins to buy 1,000 month mania, and took it back to serve as a hard-working farmer. Turning around, Ross saw that many female slaves had entered the slave market. Most of them were not wearing clothes, showing their wet body. Ross asked about the price and got a rough idea of the market. A female clerk is generally half the price of a male clerk, and 1 gold coin can only buy 1 or 2. But there are 3 grades of female slaves. There are dignitaries who are given as playthings, 20 gold coins apiece. All of them are as beautiful as flowers, and even their proud bodies are exposed. But Ross doesn't need such slaves. The second rank is the second-class slaves. These slaves generally serve as cattle and horses for the farmer. They are generally in good shape. When they look straight, they almost stand out, but they don't do much heavy work. 1 gold coin. The second most common slaves are ordinary slaves. These slaves have neither the beauty of slaves nor plaything slaves, nor much stature, and can only be used for heavy work. However, Ross felt that these slaves were no different from free men except for their status. Ross spent 2,000 gold coins to buy 700 common slaves and 50 slaves. Ordinary slaves used it to reward soldiers who obtained the status of free men to marry, have children, and start a family. And slaves stay in their fortresses to do things. On the way back, Ross declared to the slaves, "You all have the opportunity to obtain the status of free people. Farmers can accumulate a little military merit as long as they cultivate for 3 years, and female slaves, as long as they are married by free people or form a union with farmers. Yes, after 3 years of farm work, you can get the status of a free citizen. A peasant has to work for 9 years and accumulate 3 points of military merit before he can become a free citizen." When the group of slaves saw it, Ross directly said that they could become free people, and they were all excited. Especially female slaves, they must lose their bodies at least 20 times in their lives, and after they become free citizens, they can become objects of legal protection. Ross led them to the goblin forest. Because it is the territory of goblins, the slaves did not dare to step into it, but Ross stopped the knights who wanted to push them forward and said, "This is my territory, and you can stay here and develop in the future." After the slaves were settled, Ross ordered the peasants to start building buildings. The first is to buy a stone fortress with a height of 200 square meters and 5 stories. By the way, Ross drew a few circles on the blueprint, indicating where to install the 6 forts. Then, a 20 square kilometer stone wall was built around 10 slings. Next, build a moat around the stone wall. After finishing these arrangements, Ross spent 6,000 gold coins before buying the required materials, wood, stone, and various soils. Ross had these 500 peasants, 1,000 infantrymen, and 100 archers stationed here, while Uyukanshu www.uyuganshu.com himself returned to his territory with 850 female slaves and 200 retinue knights. Ross directly bypassed William's territory because he always felt that something was wrong there. By the way, I took a look at William's territory. Because it was built much earlier than himself, these troops were twice as strong as Ross's. Too bad there are no catapults and throwing carts. Ross chuckled lightly, returned to his territory, walked into Shimon, and saw a rice field not far away. The farmers have worked very hard to cultivate the fields, and the 50 square kilometers of land in the territory is basically planted, covering more than 20% of the land. Ross smiled slightly. As long as the weather is not extreme, these seedling fields can feed at least 8,000 people. Ross did the math, and with the subordinates on the Goblin Forest side and the slaves he brought from his side, there were only about 3,000 people in total. At this time, the area of miasma had already caused the tragic death of hundreds of farmers. Ross thought that the miasma should be dealt with earlier. After all, this thing will not only kill people, but also dry up rice fields, and it will spread. Therefore, Ross vigorously purchased medicines to eradicate miasma. It cost 800 gold coins to buy 50 huge jars for storing miasma. Ross thought, these miasmas might be able to defeat the enemy. After all, their own peasants couldn't bear the miasma, and the soldiers of the other side would also be hard to resist. At this time, Ross found that dozens of royal knights began to appear outside, and then hundreds of royal knights appeared. A whole royal knight order appeared 2 kilometers away and set up camp. Ross had a bad feeling when a knight reported, 2,000 infantry, 800 light knights and 300 heavy knights came outside. Ross turned his head slightly and saw a familiar flag coming towards him. It seems to be the Royal Artillery Regiment next to the Royal Knights. Ross looked at the Royal Knights 2 kilometers away in surprise, thinking how could these people appear here? Ross ordered 200 knights in medium attire to leave the city. Facing the huge oppression of the Royal Knights, the knights began to be conservative in the fortifications. The longest range of the Royal Artillery Regiment is 1,500 meters, so Ross ordered the archers not to attack. But the other party didn't move, but after half an hour, some teams from William's territory came one after another, about a few hundred people. Ross instantly understood that this was his brother starting to join forces with the nearest lord to deal with him. However, since the other party has no intention of drawing a knife to face each other now, Ross cannot break the current situation. However, if you continue to gather at this speed, Ross Castle will soon be surrounded. And Ross has ordered a part of the troops to be transferred to the Goblin Forest, and now the troops in the territory are barely enough to deal with the Royal Knights. Ross walked to the center of the fortress, summoned soldiers who had been promoted to freemen, and distributed assets to them. After they earned enough military credits, they could replace their independent tents with houses. And Ruskin began to lay out the housing area, ready to let farmers build houses. The speed of peasants building houses can almost catch up with major projects. 100 peasants can build a house in half a day. Ross first spent 200 gold coins to buy the blueprint of the Gothic building, the Harrington apartment. Then thousands of farmers started work at the same time, planning to build 15 houses in a large apartment that can accommodate 100 people in one day. While busy building territorial buildings, Ross used the barracks to continuously train the army. Some of the military merits who obtained more than 10 points of military merit became knights. Ross ordered Babur to immediately issue them the equipment of middle-mounted knights. Ross bought another 2,000 infantrymen and 200 archers. And next to the watchtower, a hanging via-style wooden tower was built. In fact, it is the irrigation tower that Ross purchased. On the one hand, it can solve the irrigation of agriculture from here, on the other hand, it can be used to strengthen the military, and more archers can stand on it during wars. Ross's agricultural development is not without success. In just 7 days, 200 mu of land has been developed. At present, the main grains produced are wheat and rice. Wheat ripens 3 times a year and rice crops twice a year. Catalytic drug, 600 gold coins, can catalyze crops within 20 acres of land to maturity, and the waiting time is reduced by 40%. Ross glanced at this thing. Although it was a bit expensive, to catalyze all the crops, it would cost at least more than 6,000 gold coins. But when the crops are mature, more wasteland can be reclaimed for farming, and then the surplus crops can be sold. Gold coins 6000. After Ross bought the catalyst, he started to give it to the soldiers to irrigate crops. After half a child, all crops began to expand rapidly, but it was obviously impossible to see the effect with the naked eye. Lord, now a large number of enemy troops have set up camp several kilometers outside the city, what should we do? Several top leaders, the more than a dozen knight commanders obtained by Ross after decentralization, each can call on hundreds of knights. Ross's territory has now exceeded 50 kilometers. Quest, expand an earl's territory, complete. Achievement obtained, count. Earn, unlock, 1,000 exploits, unlock the Knights Templar, the English longbowmen. Ross showed a slight smile and said to several knight commanders, get ready to meet the enemy immediately. Yes. Everyone said respectfully, and then quickly retreated to prepare to meet the enemy. Ross turned on the system and glanced at the prices of the Knights Templar and the English longbowmen. Knights Templar, they are good at arranging troops and have great power. They have 500 Knights Templar. At first glance, this number is not as good as the Royal Knights, but its strength is worse than the Royal Knights. Just seeing the attributes, Ross sighed, ox fork. Open the English longbowman. Ross saw that the range of the English longbow was twice that of the archer. After showing a slightly surprised expression, Ross smiled and said, brother, right, let's see how I turn defeat into victory. Immediately afterwards, Ross converted all the 2,000 points of military exploits into gold coins. Next, I reflected more than 20,000 gold coins, and used these gold coins to buy 2 Knights Templar orders and 300 English longbowmen. Wow! A fierce battle sound instantly came from outside the stone wall, and it was still like a roar even if it was 2 kilometers away. Ross saw that groups of elite knights were being slaughtered by the knights of the Royal Knights. Not far away, another army of thousands of people surrounded them, holding knights from William's territory. A distant relative is worse than a close neighbor. It's really chilling that his neighbors have teamed up with Ross's brother to kill him. Fire. Reloaded. Pong. The violent sound of artillery was deafeningly attacking the city gate of Ross. Reading www.uuganshu.com quickly penetrated the stone wall through several openings. Fortunately, the fortification of the stone wall was upgraded to the highest level by Ross, and even if it was penetrated, it did not collapse. However, the artillery also killed all the archers in Ross, and the watchtower and arrow rest were also destroyed. And it all happened in 5 minutes. Too exaggerated. But Ross did not panic. In order to prevent the buildings in the city from being affected, Ross ordered, the Knights Templar, dispatch. Wow! 500 knights wearing golden equipment, all gathered at the gate of the city, they all attacked with a single order, and they quickly tore towards the battlefield. At the next moment, the English longbowman who followed behind quickly carried a longbow that was as high as a human, and strode away on the war horse. Except for the Knights Templar smashing at an angle like a direct tear, and the situation on the battlefield began to be evenly matched, the English longbowmen spread their figures one after another. The enemy William was gasping for breath when he saw these guys fleeing on horseback. But so. Just as he was thinking this, in the next second, a sharp arrow quickly penetrated a cannon that was about to be fired. Boom! In an instant, the artillery regiment started a chain reaction like water waves, and the artillery all exploded. All the people in the artillery regiment died, and the mighty army guarding the artillery regiment also fell to their knees. How can it be? William cried out in fear. At this time, the two knights who fought together not far away, and the main force of William's more than 2,000 knights, were all killed to a pool of blood.